Welcome to Grandpa Joe's Storytime, when, on this occasion, I'll be reading from Renaissance, The Fall and Rise of the King, the work of a fellow Promoting Yorkshire Author member, Marla Skidmore. Marla's an ex-school teacher and has an academic background in history, so it's not surprising that she has written a novel set in the time of Richard III, or, to be more accurate, at the end of the reign of the Plantagenets. You might also notice that Grandpa Joe is out and about, escaping England's loveliest county of Yorkshire, venturing into the Cumbrian Lake District. Marla's novel starts with the Battle of Bosworth, a short story you might expect, because that's where Richard III was killed, opening the doors to Henry Tudor's dynasty that followed. The story has a twist, for the king is sent to purgatory and has been assigned a celestial mentor in the guise of Franciscan monk Father Gilbert. There he must face his ghosts, and the Richard that emerges contrasts sharply with that portrayed by old Shakespeare and the history books. When I read it, I discovered a unique slant on the well-known historical figure of Richard III that changed my perspective of him. He's been portrayed as evil throughout the centuries, notably because of the writings of the victors, for history is told by those who win. The book sets to redress the balance. It's well researched, an incredibly good read. Once started, you'll want to finish it for sure. My reading is close to the very start of the book, when Richard is fighting for his crown. The battle wasn't going to plan, but Richard spotted an opportunity, one that he hoped would deal with the pretender once and for all, but it would make matters worse. Grimly resolved, he fought on. He was no longer feeling the blows from the dozens of weapons that smashed through his armour when the halberd crashed viciously into the back of his skull and sent white-hot pain radiating down his spine. As he spiralled into dark nothingness, brief random thoughts flashed through his mind. This is what it feels like to die? Norfolk was right. The circlet around my helmet was a magnet for every glory-seeking Lancastrian bastard on this field. Anne, my dear late wife, be waiting for me, sweetie. I'm coming. Light filtered through Richard's closed eyelids. His eyes slowly opened. They remained unfocused and dazed for a few moments, but quickly regained their sharp clarity as the fog of unconsciousness cleared from his brain. He inhaled deeply, then coughed as his lungs were assaulted by the acrid stench of gunpowder, overridden horses, blood and sweat. He was lying on the battlefield. He gasped in disbelief. Against all odds, he was alive. Vivid images of those final moments before his enemies overwhelmed him crowded into his mind. He was down on one knee, one hand braced on the ground, the other gripping the hilt of his sword, using it as a prop to keep himself upright. He was surrounded by Welsh soldiers. They prowled around him, nostrils flaring, bodies tense, sword, mace and pike at the ready, circling him like a pack of feral dogs. He tried to struggle to his feet, but his legs gave way, and he sank to his knees once more. The halberd slammed into the back of his head with such a savage force that the whole of his compact frame jerked forward convulsively, his spine arching with the impact. Then his body folded forward and slid to the ground. Richard's belly heaved, bile rose in his throat, making him swallow rapidly. That had surely been the moment of his death. No man could survive such a blow, and he had already been badly wounded, even before the halberd smashed into his skull. He could still feel the burning pain of the sword thrust deep into his side, and the agony of splintering bone and tearing muscle when the halberd felled him. He was utterly confounded to find himself alive. He lay still and took stock. Amazingly, he could find no sign of injury, nor could he detect the stickiness of congealed blood anywhere. There was no pain, only the dull, familiar ache of overtaxed muscles tested in combat. He was breathing easily. He could move all his limbs. Richard's strongly marked brows drew together in a deep frown. I should be dead. His bewildered brain raced, searching for answers, but found none. A deep sense of misgiving crept over him, and along with it came the uneasy feeling of being watched. Slowly and carefully he lifted his head. There was nothing to see. On one side, dappled sunlight frolicked through the foliage of a copse of slender saplings. On the other there was rough pasture. Beyond that he could see ripe ears of corn blowing in the wind. I was mortally wounded. Why am I not dead? The question kept running through his mind until his head ached with the effort of trying to find an explanation for his miraculous survival. Richard lay back and let the springy marsh grass pillow his tired body. Raising a shaky forearm to shield his eyes from the sun's glare, he lay back and endeavoured to calm his tumultuous thoughts. As he listened to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, the thought slipped into his head that perhaps it was simply that his Creator had decided that he would not die on the plain of Reedmore today. That treachery and betrayal had not been allowed to prosper entirely. Slowly, the feelings of apprehension and trepidation holding his body in the tight grip began to ease. He told himself to stop being a fool. The Almighty had seen fit to preserve him. Instead of being fearful and suspicious, he should be on his knees giving thanks. He raised himself up on one elbow and saw that he was lying on the slope of a small hillock, shielded from the sun by a dense thicket of willow and alder. Above them, high in the hot August sky, black crows circled slowly, readying themselves to dive and feed on the dead and dying. How he hated those filthy scavengers. Battle-hardened veteran that he was, the scene of slaughter and butchery that met his eyes in the field below still made him retch. Amongst dead horses, broken carts and abandoned wagons, half hidden by long tufts of marsh grass, lay the bodies of the dead and wounded of both armies. Their limbs twisted grotesquely. They were strewn across the rough pasture, the sun's rays glinting off their swords and breastplates. It was as if some giant evil puppet master, grown tired of his playthings, had wantonly destroyed them and then flung them away. A light breeze ruffled the long green fronds, causing them to swirl and drift over the mangled and mutilated bodies, as if a disapproving nature was attempting to spread a concealing veil over the bloody spectacle. A pall of smoke still hanging over the silent field was starting to thin, beginning a slow, writhing climb up into the cloudless sky. In the distance, on the edge of the plain, the red dragon standard of Henry Tudor and the red rose banner of Lancaster fluttered victoriously in the warm summer air. As he fought to control the gorge rising in his throat, the thought struck Richard that having seen him go down, his supporters would surely think their king dead and their cause lost. From the position of the sun in the sky, he calculated that it was now well after noon. They would either have fled the battlefield or surrendered. Richard felt he ought to be filled with despair and fear for what the future held, but all he could feel at the moment was a profound sense of gratitude at having eluded death. although the ugly reality of his predicament swiftly began to filter into his mind. Any moment now, Henry Tudor and his treacherous supporters would come looking for his body. To claim Richard's throne, the Tudor needed to prove that he was dead. The people had to see his corpse. When it could not be found, there was a possibility that he was still alive. There would be a hue and cry. He was about to become a hunted fugitive. His mind began to race. He chastised himself. "Don't lie there wasting precious time, Dickon, my lad. It could cost you your life. Give thanks to your Creator for preserving you to fight another day. And get on your feet. Get off this battlefield now." He took a moment to think about what he should do next. "Disguise yourself. Make your way north," he told himself. "The people of the north have always been loyal to you. You are Richard, their Lord of the North. Once you are amongst your people again, you can regroup and take back your kingdom." Richard paused for a long, anguished moment when he recalled that he was alone now. The weight of recent grief and loss lay heavily in his heart. His brothers were all dead. Edward, his son, was buried at Middleham, and he had laid his beloved Anne to rest in the Abbey of Westminster only a few short months ago. An insidious little voice inside his head asked, "Is it worth all the struggle and the bloodshed? Would it not be easier to leave England, seek sanctuary with my sister Margaret in Burgundy, and live there in comfortable obscurity? Why not let Henry Tudor have the throne, with all its turmoil, rumour and rebellion?" Then he heard his father's voice growling out the rule that he'd insisted all his sons live by. "A Plantagenet never gives up. The throne of England is ours by right." Pushing aside destructive self-doubt, Richard raised himself to his knees. A feeling of lightheadedness made him sit back on his haunches as he allowed his swirling senses to settle. It dawned on him that he had managed this manoeuvre effortlessly. There was no armour weighing himself down and restricting his movements. Frowning, he rose stiffly to his feet and looked down. Whilst he had been unconscious, someone had removed his armour. In confusion, he looked around. Were the human vultures that scavenged the fields of death already engaged in their grisly task of robbing the dead and wounded? If so, when they saw him still breathing, why hadn't they killed him? Raising his left hand, he saw that he was still wearing the heavy gold ring engraved with his boar device and personal vow to his wife, given to him by Anne on the anniversary of their first year of marriage. With every instinct sharpened and on the alert for danger, Richard's gaze swept over the battlefield. Nothing moved, the eerie silence disturbed only by the buzzing of clouds of black flies hovering over the bloody corpses unsettled him. Anxiety began to bubble up inside him again. He hated this feeling of not being in control. Cursing beneath his breath, he rubbed the back of his neck and tried to ease the tension building there. After a moment, he took a long, shuddering breath to calm his whirling thoughts and let the pragmatist in him take over. "Don't fret about questions you cannot answer. It's a dangerous waste of time. Use your wits, Dickon. Think. What would you do in the Tudors' place where no dead king's body can be found?" He gave an ironic chuckle. "That's easily answered. Immediately send out search parties to scour the countryside, and every town and village within a day's march from here. Station lookouts on every road north." And so his own plan of action began to take shape. He would stay off the well-trodden routes to the north using drovers' tracks. He would first head east, deep into the Lincolnshire wolds. Only then would he turn northwards towards the Humber. Once he was across that great river, he would be safe in the loyal north. He would make his way to York, and there in that trusty city he would rally his supporters. Richard weighed up the practicalities of his plan. Travelling alone, on foot, through the wild, densely wooded countryside of Middle England and the north was a dangerous undertaking. He would be seen as an easy target for those cutthroats and thieves who preyed on lone, unprotected travellers. He had to equip himself for the journey. He required a weapon with which to defend himself, and also any small items that he could barter or sell for food. There was no alternative but to take what he needed from the dead lying in the field below. His ring was useless. Its obvious quality and the boar engraving would swiftly raise suspicions. Reluctantly, Richard began to make his way down the slope. The muscles in his jaw grew rigid. His throat thickened with shame and self-loathing at what he was about to do. "I'm joining the ranks of those filthy scavengers who prey on the fallen," he thought in disgust. Taking a deep breath, hands fisting against the compulsion to turn and flee, he forced himself forward towards a tangled mound of bodies. Desperate, hand-to-hand fighting had taken place here. The soft ground beneath them was churned and stained deep rusty ochre with their blood. The air was heavy with the stench of brutal butchery. Swallowing the sour tang in his mouth, Richard resolutely crouched down. Reaching towards the nearest body, he found himself gazing into the stiff, dead face of one of his own personal guard. Flinching, Richard drew back and straightened up. He looked more closely at the other dead men lying at his feet. His teeth clenched as he fought to hold back an overwhelming wave of sadness when he identified at least half a dozen of his closest night companions. Men who had fought with him at Barnet, Tewkesbury and in the Scottish campaign. They lay together in a tight semicircle, and in their midst, stained with their bloods but still protected by the hacked and butchered body of Sir Percy Thirlwall, his standard-bearer, lay his own red and blue banner, bearing the white rose and white boar. His loyal and courageous comrades in arms had ridden into the melee after their reckless king in an effort to protect him, and had been cut down trying to do so. With intense sorrow and deep remorse washing through him, Richard knelt and bowed his head in prayer. "I beg forgiveness, my brave and gentle friends. My reckless foolhardiness cost you your lives." He swallowed hard and wondered again why he was still alive. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached forward to close what seemed to him the reproachful eyes of the nearest fallen knight. Raised voices from behind the crest of the hill had him lifting his head abruptly. He listened intently. "He's somewhere hereabouts, sire, I'm sure of it. I remember that small hillock and that stand of trees. Somewhere just below we had the usurper surrounded." An agitated voice confirmed, then rambled on excitedly. "'Twasn't easy to bring him down. Fought somewhat fierce. He gave a good account of himself, gutted a few of us well and good afore that Albert finally dispatched him. Then find the body without further delay. I need proof to show the people, so there will be no rumours of his survival to stoke up rebellions," a thin, impatient voice ordered. "Christ wounds!" Richard swore under his breath. He had run out of time. Henry Tudor was already here on the battlefield searching for him. Arming himself with a fallen knight's sword, he swiftly pounded up the rise, throwing himself behind the dense foliage of the small copse of trees. Concealed behind a trailing curtain of willow branches, Richard watched as Henry Tudor's men spread out and methodically began to search for his body. The rebels showed scant respect for the dead. Bodies were turned over and examined. Anything of value found on them was plundered, and then they were roughly dragged to one side to form a steadily mounting pile of corpses. Any of Richard's men found to be still alive were dispatched with a swift and merciless efficiency, as the occasional choking gasp and abruptly cut off moan bore witness to. It was only a matter of time before his enemies worked their way up the hill. Resolutely his fingers tightened on the hilt of his borrowed sword. He would not cower here, waiting to be found. nor would he allow himself to be taken alive to face an ignominious death at the hands of a man whose claim to the throne was dubious, that it was a travesty, through a female, and tainted by illegitimacy. Richard closed his eyes. Better to die fighting. Taking a deep breath, he moved out from beneath the trees. A shout of triumph halted him before he could step into the open. Here he is. This is him. This is Richard. We found the king. Surprise held him immobile. His gaze swung over to the place where his dead comrades lay, to see two red-coated Welshmen bending over the mangled body of Sir Percy. Alerted by their cry of recognition, the lanky figure of Henry Tudor strode rapidly across the field towards them, trailed by his uncle, Jasper Tudor, and the commander of his army, the Earl of Oxford. "Show me," he demanded, his small, light blue eyes narrowing in anticipation. When they failed to move quickly enough, he roughly pushed aside the two excited soldiers and pulled away the bloody banner shrouding the body himself. Richard smiled cynically. "You're about to be disappointed, you treacherous bastard. I'm still very much alive." Henry's narrow-shouldered, slightly stooping figure took on an uncanny stillness as he stared intently down at the body lying at his feet. His thin, sallow face showed no emotion. After long, silent moments, he raised his head heavenward. Inhaling deeply, he smiled. "It is done. England is mine," he whispered beneath his breath. Then, giving his men a curt nod of acknowledgement, he pointed to a grimy, undernourished grey cob placidly cropping the grass a short distance below Richard's hiding place. "Strip the body and load it onto the horse," Henry ordered. The men eagerly sprang to do his bidding. Hearing Henry Tudor's instructions, Richard flinched, his lips curled contemptuously at his enemy's lack of knightly chivalry and respect for a fallen adversary. Recollection of Henry's odd instruction, however, rapidly turned his disgust to bemusement. "Is the whoreson intending to pass Sir Percy off as me?" Richard wondered, shaking his head in disbelief. "He cannot be so lack-witted. Sir Percy was a very large and robustly built man. I am of a much slighter stature." Mystified, Richard watched and waited as the two men struggled to untangle Sir Percy's heavy body from the corpses of the other dead knights. Word quickly spread that the slain king had been found. Searchers all over the battlefield abandoned their grisly work. Jubilant Lancastrians of every rank, from humble foot soldier to high-ranking knights, gathered around the spot where the supposed body of the dead king lay, craning their necks and jostling one another to get a better look at the royal corpse. Suddenly, a hush descended upon the assembled soldiers. Richard inhaled sharply when he got a glimpse of the naked, battered body being dragged by its feet through the silently parted men. It was not the corpse of his standard-bearer. A low rumble of protest began to ripple through the men. "For shame! Is there a need to dishonour him so? He was an anointed king. He fought bravely." Henry Tudor's body tensed at the criticism. His narrow lips flattened in anger. Drawing himself up to his full height, he swung around. "Who dares to question the actions of his king?" he snarled, glaring at them, his stony stare challenging anyone to say anything further. Fury sizzled along Richard's veins. He was unable to hold back a cynical bark of laughter. The treacherous cur had yet to be accepted by his peers and Parliament, and be properly anointed and crowned, yet already he styled himself as king. The elevation of the ground and the protection of the trees gave Richard a clearer view of the body that had been roughly dropped on the soft grass beside the hooves of the waiting horse. This man's frame was slight, yet even in death the tough sinew and corded muscles of a hardened warrior were evident. Richard felt a strange sense of recognition. Did he know this man? he felt compelled to take a closer look and edged further down the slope to the fringe of the trees, as far as he could go without being seen. The feeling of familiarity intensified. He strained forward, narrowing his eyes to study the dead man more closely. He was bloody, so very, very bloody. His shoulders, chest and back were coated in it, and his thick, dark, blonde hair was matted and caked with it. There was a deep gash in his side from a sword thrust between his ribs. The back of the poor wretch's skull had been crushed, and there was a jagged, gaping wound between his shoulder and neck. Richard's body stilled. A feeling of foreboding crept through him. His scalp began to prickle. The hair at the back of his neck lifted. The injuries he was staring down at were agonizingly familiar. Chills skittered up his spine. His heart started pounding. Enough of this foolishness, he rebuked himself sternly. Hundreds of men received such wounds in battle. Slowly, Richard let out the breath he had unknowingly been holding. Shaking his head, he scolded himself soundly once more for allowing irrational imaginings to get the better of him. Then his eyes took in the twist of the dead man's spine. Richard froze. His eyes widened in disbelief. Very few in court even remembered his weakness. It only troubled him when he had been on a horse for too long. Then his back stiffened and his legs ached. A cold sweat sprang out all over his body. He began to shake uncontrollably. No! His mind screamed a denial. The naked body lying on the trampled grass below was not his own corpse. It cannot be so. I live. Richard's vision blurred. The world began to spin around him. The sword he was holding slipped from his suddenly slack grip. Making the sign of the cross, he stumbled backwards until his calves hit the moss-covered trunk of a rotting tree. He slumped down, dropping his head, which felt as if it was about to explode, into cold, clammy hands. Unable to stop himself, he raised fearful eyes once more to the horror confronting him. Transfixed, he watched as the dead man was carelessly slung over the back of the waiting horse, his feet hanging down one side, his head and arms on the other. To secure him in place, a rope was tied around his neck, passed beneath the animal's belly and attached to his feet. The soft gleam of gold on the third finger of one hand caught Richard's eye. Breathing suddenly became difficult. His breath rasped in his throat as he gasped for air. Questions scurried round his fevered brain, like rats caught in a trap. If that was his corpse, and he was dead, why was he still here on the battlefield? He had made his confession and had been absolved of his sins before going into battle. Why had he not joined his Creator in the next world? Was he a ghost, doomed to haunt this battlefield for eternity? If he was a ghost, why did he still have his senses? He could see, hear, touch, smell and feel. The muscles in Richard's stomach grew rigid as he fought to control the primal scream of terror rising in his throat. Jerkily he stood up and ran shaking hands down his tense body. His trembling fingers reached up to touch his mouth, his nose, his eyes. They ran over his brow, through his hair, drawing it back from his face to knead the knotted muscles at the back of his neck. If I am dead, why do I feel so alive? The question spun round and round in his mind in a never-ending cycle. Finally, in a desperate attempt to convince himself that he was still amongst the living, Richard picked up the sword he had dropped. He stared intently at it, then slowly and deliberately he drew the razor-sharp blade across the open palm of his hand, pressing it deep. The burning pain made the breath hiss through his clenched teeth, but seeing no hot rush of blood run from the gaping wound, he fell despairingly to his knees, clutching the injured hand to his chest. "Do no further harm to yourself, my son. 'Tis a sin." A deep, authoritative voice from behind, accompanied by a firm pressure of strong fingers on his shoulder, made Richard start. Fear shot through him. Flinging up a protective arm, he swung around to find himself looking into the craggy face of a tall, robustly built monk wearing the coarse habit of the Franciscan order. Translucent icy blue eyes frowned down at him in disapproval. "Cease this futile struggle against the truth, and stop torturing yourself." Giving him no time to move or speak, the monk pulled him to his feet and turned him to face the battlefield. "You must accept that this day you died on that field." Suddenly weak, Richard's legs gave way. He would have fallen if the monk's brawny arms had not held him upright. "You've never lacked courage, Richard Plantagenet," the monk's gravelly voice growled into his ear. "Go." His powerful hands eased their hard grip. "Test the truth of my words. Your enemies cannot see you. You need take but a few short steps to examine the mauled and brutalized shell that was once a king, lying on the back of that horse." Still held in the monk's supporting hold, Richard hesitated. Bleakly, he gazed out over the battlefield, whilst his tortured brain struggled vainly against the reality of his death. But in truth, he could no longer deny it. The gruesome, bloody proof was right there below him, slung over the back of a worn-out nag. Closing his eyes, Richard gave a long, painful sigh of acceptance. Well, I hope you enjoyed the longer reading this time. Necessary, I think, to give you a flavour of the depth of the writing. With apologies to Marla Skidmore, the author, for I have added a few words of explanation in some places to give the short extract context, explained elsewhere in the novel, of course. Well, come back again for more Grandpa Joe's Storytime, and please do subscribe to our channel.